one experienced the next, and so they have to sort of be essential in that way. So there's been from the early, like that first Convergence residency of just seeing, one of the things was just like, what are the limits of people actually participating and being led around by geolocation? Or what's the storytelling mechanics that can you follow a narrative that connects these various geolocations? How does that technology get in your way or not? How does it change what you're doing? And we were working with other people's work, other people's rehearsals. How does it change what they're doing to then ask them to move it into another location? How do those aspects change? And then how do the ultimate locations get you to decide like various character points? We ended up in the final showing of it in the Indianapolis residency was in a space that's a deconsecrated church, so we use that to our advantage, where the narrative, we had to think about how the audience would experience it, how they'd move around. So it was built to be around the grounds of this former church, so that we'd borrow from the reality of it there. And bringing in lots of different people up until the point at which now we are with a set cast of people who are playing specific characters. That's all sort of come together. That's almost come together towards the end, is that we wanted to make sure that the way that we got them to interact had a lot of integrity first. Yeah. And that's gone through a number of different vetting processes.
I wanted to take this moment also to just describe what a dramaturge is. I'm not sure if that's been said at all, and as a dramaturge, most of the time people don't understand what that is. So since we're talking so much about dramaturgy and how it's really important to the show, dramaturge in general, the best description I usually use is when it's new play development, it's often like a researcher editor. So usually if it's just one-to-one normal performance, it's a lot of going back and forth with the playwright creators and trying to make sure the story makes sense. And we're protecting the world of the story. In this project, it really is, for me, a very hybrid role of vetting a lot of these things that we're going through on the bigger scale and protecting the story in a way bigger scope to make sure it works across all these various things, across all these various nonlinear bits and translate to different performance types. So I've been consulting for a long time with Ian about both the research of the world and how we build it in terms of making the science work, and how our story is different than other stories out there talking about first contact. And then as the stories progressed, really working closely to watch, even from the first interactions and with the cast now, to make sure that it's going to be something that people can enter and understand at every point.
Yeah, I'd actually add perhaps that the show originates in dramaturgy. We did a lot of dramaturgy before anything was written. So as opposed to what I'm used to in a process of developing new work in which there's a dramaturge that's been brought onto a project in which there's a playwright developing a thing, and then there's somebody to make sure that it has integrity. We've started with the background infrastructure, and then as a team of writers come in to here's the world in which we've created that we think is consistent, and written into that world versus trying to justify the world that we've written.
On that note, we wrote relatively late in this process too. Yeah. It was a very different process as a writer to go through, because originally, most of the time when I'm working on a new play or a new screenplay, it's you do a little bit of outlining and then you just start writing and you figure out the rest as you go. This process for us was more like a year and a half, for me since I came on, of plotting out the entire process and then writing. But it made the writing easier once you got to it, because we already knew so much about the world.
It writes itself.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but it was a shorter actual drafting process because we'd done so much hard work before that started.
Yeah, there's that Sagan quote: if you want to bake an apple pie, at first you have to create the universe.
Sagan really relates to this too.
So there's Sagan's a big inspiration in the writing here. So to write a show that has a immersive world building component, first you have to create the universe in which it exists.
Yeah. So, Justine, we've been talking about like the nature of dramaturgy in the show, how you guys have been anticipating different audience reactions to this in terms of like how people are consuming the different parts of it and the different orders that they could consume it, and also how our creative team is planning, or your creative team is planning on kind of gauging reactions or using those reactions to be able to influence like future iterations of this, or what of that has happened so far. So we've heard a little bit about the version of transmission that happened at Indy Convergence in this deconsecrated church, and how much space and landscape tends to inform the story and the characters in a really organic way, as opposed to going somewhere and then maybe letting your place and your characters inform your script, and then taking that script and putting it inside a specific like black box theater or theater in the round. So it's a different way of working, and also a different way of tracking a story dramaturgically to be able to see that all of your characters are tracking and tracking for an audience in the essentially endless ways that you could see this thing.
I think we consume media now not one at a time. Like, we don't just sit down and watch TV. Like, and our lives are such, especially with little kids, where there's like multiple things going on at once and multiple inputs. People are watching TV with their phones, like hence writers live tweeting while their shows are on. And this is just reflecting the way that many people consume stories now, and also giving them an opportunity to like physically be within the story in a way that I find really appealing and fun. When I was at CalArts, my thesis was a novel and stories, so this construction excited me, and I think I added something to it from that perspective too.
I loved whenever Justine would bring in comments, because she'd always be like, what more conflict can we put here? Which is an important question when you're writing anything, but in this is super important, because why else would you go somewhere to watch something? Something big has to be happening.
Why would you go out of your way to go to a cafe to listen to something when, especially the festival is going on, the Fringe is going on too, and standing out within those many, many different performances and experiences that are going on. Part of it too, I think, is in thinking about Edinburgh, is that there is a bit of downtime in between when you're seeing performances. So doing something like a dramatic version of a guided tour of these places to a fake history is kind of fun in terms of like an interstitial activity during the Fringe.
Yeah.
The Fringe itself is a kind of haunting of Edinburgh too, because it's this like whole other city and world where performances happen in places that shouldn't, are not safe to have them happen. And so I think that like appealed to us too.
Yeah, I think there's something so appropriate about a play about or a story about connectivity and connection across civilizations and across galaxies, but also across different cultures and different family styles and different values, to have that be something that you fit into the rest of your day at the Fringe as an audience member, that it's something where you go from place to place and you're doing other things, and then all of a sudden a transmission scene pops up on the lawn that you're walking across, or you have 50 minutes for your lunch break and you go and seek it out. But it does mean that every scene has to be its own kind of self-contained little opera act, even if it's only 5 minutes long, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's interesting to think about it as opera. Because it's so dramatic that way. I don't have much background with opera.
Yeah.
But
it's got sort of that scale and, like, the world building, that operatic scale of, like, it takes place in the world as opposed to, like, here's this, like, intense living room drama. Though so many aspects of it, as we know from recording it, are like, this took place in a kitchen, this took place in a bar. Like, they're things that are contained, but the twist on it in this is that they all exist in a very large world that the audience can actually feel that largeness.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me too. One of the parts that was very interesting when we started working with this in Indianapolis at the Indy Convergence was thinking about how we dramatize and make really personal individual moments into something that's now public. So the fact that this is happening in an alleyway where somebody is breaking down, like literally just falling apart because there's so many big things happening, is really integral to the project, because it's also like somebody on their own could be experiencing this, or even if they're in a group, if you've got headphones on, you're on your device, you're alone experiencing it. So there's this like real thought about what's public and what's private, and if you're experiencing in a group or if you're experiencing on your own, that is constantly happening in the piece.
Yeah, and if I can jump on that, when we started the Indianapolis residency, like, our rehearsal process was like, we have these 5 different conditions in which we want to try and build scenes and see how people observe them and how satisfying they are. And they were things like, we're going to do it in an alleyway, and we defined an alleyway as like a semi-private transitory space. And we wanted to an epic event viewed at a distance, and a personal drama viewed from high up downwards, and vice versa. So, like, the actual start of it was all mechanical. There was one which is, I think, one of the ones that has been the most consistent throughout up to this point, which was a domestic scene that you view from outside of the domestic space. And so all of these different aspects is where we started, and then as we're essentially devising with the ensemble into these spaces, the story actually came out of, like, what are the types of scenes that work in those conditions.
Yeah. Can I actually get everybody to kind of touch back on Indianapolis and Indy Convergence, and just kind of hear stories from each of you, preferably, about, like, things that were memorable about the first iterations of this, and then just kind of little snapshots of things that have been memorable about that specifically there. And then maybe another one at the Fringe, and then just going into overview mode very quickly. I do want to hear a little bit about how the research portion of this podcast came into being, just so that we can have that as kind of a bridge factor. And then I would like to hear a little bit more about kind of working and traveling with kids and assembling the yes. And it's something that people are very much curious about and very much struggling. I think sometimes struggling with. Yeah. So I think it's always important for people to hear about that kind of thing, and then perhaps kind of assembling our current cast and funding, and then we can just that's kind of the scope that I'm thinking of before we wrap this up. Does that sound good for everyone? Is there anything else that people want on that list? Because I've got it written down.
Who wants to go first?
I can kick off the indie stuff. So, I mean, personally, I've been involved in the Indy Convergence since 2008 as the resident designer. So I've been involved in, up until this year, where because of this project I don't have time to go, I've been involved in every project that's sort of come through that. And so it took until that time to say, like, oh, and every year there's been this umbrella project idea, which is like something that everybody works on. And as we were deciding as a staff of people who regularly work there,